Hey everyone, this is Talkback. It's Tuesday, September 8th, the day after Labor Day. Normally, we're getting back to normal. That's a word that we like to use this time of year. Back to school, back to work, away from our summer retreats and off to the job of learning, doing, and working. Only this is not a normal year. And we're turning to our Lieutenant Governor to help us wend our way through this year. We talked last week about the recovery in Connecticut, how we're doing with COVID, opening our schools, our businesses. And today we want to talk about the importance of voting for November 3rd, the census, and the centennial of women having the right to vote since the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, 100 years. And because of COVID, we haven't been able to have the great outdoor and in-person celebrations that we should be having about this important event. But we'll talk about it and we'll have other ways of celebrating and commemorating. So good afternoon, Lieutenant Governor Susan. Good to have you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to see you virtually and look forward to when I can come back in studio with you.
Someday soon. The studio's not even open yet. And, you know, everything is virtual these days, it seems. Indeed. That's it. So last week we talked somewhat about the recovery, and we talked about the economic picture, a little bit about schools reopening. Just one final thought on that. There was an article in the Hartford Courant today that was cautioning the state, be careful. We're having the fall season. We're having the flu. Schools are opening, but we have to be very careful. We've got lessons from states around the country who are opening schools, colleges, even elementary schools. And things are happening that are making them shut down or change. So, Lieutenant Governor, how are we in Connecticut going to avoid that? How are we going to have the right science, the right information to do the right thing and keep our good record going?
So here's what the plan is, and we've asked each of our school districts to be flexible and to make a plan for all in-person and a combination of online and in person, and finally online only. And some school districts opted, and there are a bunch of them in Eastern Connecticut that opted for all in person. Some opted for a hybrid, and some opted for completely online, at least to start. And what I can tell you is this, having visited schools in Vernon, Meriden, New Britain today, and tomorrow I'm going to Norwalk. I can tell you that a lot of thought was really put into how to keep kids safe, to separate the kids by 6 feet plus apart. So you see wide-spaced desks. You see plexiglass to protect the teacher at his or her desk. Lots of hand sanitizer, plans for lunchroom cohorts where you will have 3 kids at a table where once 12 kids sat together. So they put a lot of thought into it. I'll also say that the children that I saw in an elementary school today were all wearing masks from ages 3 all the way up to 5th graders were wearing masks. They were excited to be back at school. The teachers seemed very excited to be there. So all this, I think, is really good news. And what I was getting from the principals and the superintendents was this. You have, for instance, in Vernon, 20% of the kids doing the home learning and the rest in school. And once kids went back to school, parents started to hear about what the protections were for the students and the teachers, and then were calling administrators asking if they could actually send their kids in person. So I think it's all about making parents and students feel comfortable going back to in-person learning.
Good. Are there any precautions taken when kids and teachers enter school? Are they doing anything like checking temperatures or asking about colds or sniffles?
In some schools, they are, and some schools have, nurses there in case kids do spike of fever or, seem like they're having symptoms. But also the other thing I wanted to say, Sheila, is that on a regional basis, the state will continue to monitor the metrics because those metrics will be in place to give schools guidance as to whether they need to go from an in-person to a hybrid or to a completely online method of learning. But fingers crossed, at the moment, everything is right now, all our metrics are very good. Our infection rate is under 1%. Our, our number of people in the hospital is very low. And when we do see a small spike, because of rapid testing and contact tracing, we're able to prevent that from becoming, a full-blown problem. So far, so good.
Okay, so I think the important thing to stress there is we have trust in our governor, our lieutenant governor, the public health community, the scientists. So we have trusted them and we believe when they tell us things and when they make suggestions. That's not the case in the whole country and in other states. So let's hope that Connecticut can continue to be a beacon for other areas and doing the right thing and using proper scientific measures to figure out how to proceed. But that's the problem. So many of us are feeling that we're adrift in this country in terms of a national strategy. And that, of course, can seep into what's going on in Connecticut, even if we're doing a good job. So let's hope that the country wakes up to do the right thing this fall, and let's see what happens. It's not a good trajectory so far, sadly, in terms of how many deaths we're still having every day in this country, notwithstanding the great job we're doing in Connecticut.
And I do want to say thank you to the people of Connecticut for listening, because when the governor and I asked people to wear masks when they were out in public, and we asked people to keep social distance, to, stay at home if they felt ill, people really did it. People responded. Right. And we appreciate that. And without everyone's help and participation and following those protocols, we wouldn't be in this good place. So, yes, part of it was the governor's leadership, but a big part of it was the people of Connecticut stepped forward and helped, and we appreciate
That's true. So, yes, the great majority of our citizens listened and are trying to do the right thing.
Right.
I mean, but we did have somewhat of the politicization, which is absolutely unconscionable and ridiculous from a scientific point of view, of people who are filing lawsuits because people are asking them to wear masks and taking away their freedoms. It is really outrageous when we need to follow the science and do the right thing to make a political issue out of this. But we know where that's coming from, and we'll move on and hope most people know that they need to follow the science and do the right thing. Let's get to the issues that are coming up for the election, as well as our commemorations. Mm-hmm. The census. Last time you were on a couple of months ago, you talked about the importance of it. I think we need to reiterate how important it is to count everybody, to follow through on the census, because that gives us our number of representatives in Congress. It gives us the funding formulas for so many of the projects. Talk about that, Susan, because it's very important, and the census is still ongoing. And I believe there are many stories about the Trump administration trying to make obstacles to proper counting. Talk about that.
So, first of all, good news. We are at 94.1% of our households have completed the census. So 69.5% of the people in Connecticut, 69.5% of the households have self-responded to the census. And that is exactly what we were in 2010. So we have an excellent response rate. But here's even better news. enumerators, the people who knock on doors for the Census Bureau in Connecticut, have been working very hard in our state since July 23rd, and our total response rate is at 94.1%. So 94% of our households have responded to the census, and so our message is to the remaining 6% of the households: you have until September 30th to respond to the census. So you can go online at 2020census.gov and complete it. It'll take you 5 minutes or less. You can call the 800 number, or when a census worker knocks on your door, please respond. It'll take you, it's contactless to fill it out. The census worker will be wearing PPE. So please, if you're one of those households, the 6% of the households that didn't fill it out, please take a moment between now and September 30th to do so, because for each person we undercount, we lose $2,900 each year for 10 years, or $29,000 per person. So that is a lot of money for a community to lose out. So please, please fill it out if you're part of that 6% that hasn't.
Is there any particular demographic or location where the 6% are? Is it more in the rural areas of the state, or in the inner cities?
It's everywhere. It's hard to count areas. So some of our cities, like Hartford and Bridgeport, had a lot of census tracts earlier on, where many had not. And there are some hard to count rural areas as well. So for your viewers in Eastern Connecticut, there are some hard to count areas, even in the more rural parts of the state. And we really do urge folks who haven't completed the census to either call the 800 number, go online, or answer the door when the census worker knocks. And also, one other note: in some hard to count areas, the Census Bureau is going to do one more mailing in Connecticut. So if you see a form in the mail and you haven't responded, take that opportunity as well.
Okay. So are there enough workers wearing the protective gear to hit every household that hasn't responded yet? Are there enough of those?
So there are several thousand people were hired to do part-time work for the Census Bureau, and people were hired right from their own community, which is nice. So people tend to be hired in areas where they know people, which is a really good thing. People were hired because of their ability to speak Spanish or other languages. And those folks are out working, and they're going to be working hard right up through the end of September. And I'll say, Sheila, that actually there was a lawsuit filed in federal court in California to keep the census workers working through the end of October. So a judge in federal court in California has issued a temporary restraining order and has said that the census workers are going to work through the end of Halloween. So we don't know how all of that is going to work out, but we do know that census workers will be in Connecticut through September 30th.
Oh, okay, good. So will that federal lawsuit pertain to other states too, or just California at this point?
So we'll have to see what happens, and you're a lawyer, so you know how this works. We don't know if there will be appeals and what will happen as it moves up the chain of the federal appellate court to the U.S. Supreme Court. But I'm expecting we'll have a decision pretty quickly, because the census is something that happens every 10 years. And if we're fighting about whether there's a September 30th stop date in the enumeration or October 31st, we're going to have an answer right away. So I think we're going to see pretty quick judicial action to settle that point.
Well, yes, we know that the courts can order expedited hearings. We also know that in some of, unfortunately, the political cases that we have, when you want an expedited hearing, sometimes you've got to wait months purposely to get something done. But that's another issue. And it's important to reiterate again that the census is counting persons in the household and not counting citizens. Just talk about that.
So, right. So the president had made an issue and earlier in the census taking a year ago in the summertime, there was a case before the Supreme Court about whether a citizenship question, are you a U.S. citizen, yes or no, would be included in the census. And the Supreme Court made the decision that that question could not be included. And so there still may be some confusion out there, Sheila, so thank you for asking. But that question is not on the census, and any information you do give to the Census Bureau will be kept private and confidential. And none of the information you give the Census Bureau can be used by any law enforcement agency. So we want people to feel safe and secure filling it out, whether you're a citizen or not. And we want people to know that it's very important for federal resources coming to each community, but it's particularly important for urban communities.
Right. Well, notwithstanding those safeguards you're talking about, unfortunately, again, with the Trump administration, they have no respect for the rule of law. And so I think consequently, there's probably still are people in this country who are in the shadows and afraid to give the information. Don't you think that probably makes up some of the 6% who aren't responding?
You know, unfortunately, because of the citizenship controversy, there is fear in immigrant communities and communities of color about coming forward. And I know that because when we were out door knocking in New London, in Bridgeport, in New Haven, people actually told us they were afraid to fill it out. And so education about the investment that will come to communities if people fill it out is really important. And here's the thing. I think our national leadership right now was trying to discourage investment in the neediest urban communities across our country. And the way to fight back is to stand up and be counted. I like to say that the census is a social justice issue. It's an issue about showing our government leaders at the state level and at the national level who we are as a country.
Right. And of course, it also has, as besides your social justice component, it has an electoral component because, you know, we used to have 6 Congress people in Connecticut, and now we only have 5 and 2 senators. We used to have 8 electoral votes. We only have 7. Do people know that the census determines the distribution of the Congress districts in the state and makes a difference in how many electoral votes we have?
So you're so right to point out it's not just about economic resources, it's about political power as well. And we want to make sure that it's important for people to stand up and be counted. The current administration is also saying they only want to count citizens toward the number of for congressional reapportionment purposes. And again, that is against the Constitution. The Constitution says very clearly each person should be counted, and congressional apportionment is based on the number of people not the number of citizens versus non-citizens. So again, there's been an attempt, unfortunately, to politicize something that's never been political, and that is the census. And so we just want to encourage everyone, particularly that remaining 6% in our state, to please fill out your census online, on the phone, or when a census worker knocks on your door.
Well, it's a sad commentary to realize that Trump and his campaign want fewer people to vote. It's as simple as that. He wants confusion. He wants an uproar about how the votes will be counted, about the mail-in voting. So let's get, just in terms of counting people, when they wrote the Constitution, you know, Susan, we had slaves who could not vote. Women couldn't vote, yet women were counted as persons and slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person. Talk about that.
Well, that's so true. And I think that brings us to one of the other topics we wanted to speak about, which is this year, August 19th, was the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in our country. And it was just a long struggle that started in the early 1800s and took until 1920 for white women to get the right to vote. But then it took an additional 45 years until the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Acts to enfranchise, finally, people of color in our country. And if you go back to 1920, you'll see that 8 million women voted in 1920. Today, there are more than 68 million women who are eligible to vote in our national election. And it's critical that every woman and every man who is eligible to vote participates on November 3rd, because so much depends on it.
Right.
Our public health, our democracy, our economy, everything.
Right. Just to go back to what you said about the 19th Amendment in 1920, it gave women of all races the right to vote. But you're right, because of Jim Crow laws, especially in the South, neither black men or black women really were able to vote without literacy tests, without violence perpetrated against them, whether it was the Klan or through lynching. For poll taxes, they were not able to vote until the Civil Rights Movement brought about the Voting Rights Act in 1965. People marched and died for voting rights in the American South. So we need to point that out as well, right?
We do. It is something that took struggle, tenacity. Women and people of color were imprisoned, injured. People died in the civil rights movement in the 1960s during both sets of struggles. And the way I like to think of the suffrage celebration is it's a reminder of how far we still have to go, right? In 1920 or 1965, whatever your metric is, all women finally got the right to vote. But look at where we are. Today we have 107 women in our Congress, and it's about 26% of our members of Congress, U.S. Senate, U.S. House, that are in our federal branch of government. But we only have 9 women governors, 15 women lieutenant governors, and 8 attorneys general that are women. And in our state legislature here in Connecticut, we have 27% women. So even though women have the right to vote, here we are 100 years later, or even 50 years later, and we have not achieved parity of people in elective office. So there's still so far to go. So I tell young people and women all the time, please make sure you register to vote, make sure you vote, and please think about running for office.
Right. Well, you mentioned some statistics, but you left out the most important one.
What's that?
So many countries around the world have already had a woman president, prime minister, leader of their parliaments, and we still have not. I don't know why we keep saying that we are a forward-looking Western democracy. We do not lead the way, certainly in women in elective office. So we have a long way to go. And in the same sense in voting rights, because you know, Susan, that a few years ago, the Supreme Court struck down one of the most important provisions of the Voting Rights Act that had to clear laws passed by states in case they violated people's right to vote. Supreme Court said, "Oh, we have no more racism in voting. We're all done." That wasn't true, and that plus the racial justice issues that are fomenting all around us every day in this country now show us how far we still have to go. Why don't you talk about that?
So they do, and look, I think that this past few months, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, we had people all over the country and people right here in Connecticut go out and protest the police brutality that we still have, unfortunately, in Connecticut. And that led to the passage of our police accountability and transparency bill, one of the strongest in the country. But COVID-19 has sort of laid bare the inequities that still exist in our state and our country in terms of healthcare, housing, workforce, education. So there are still many more inequities to address. And one way that, and one very big way that the governor and I are hoping to address those structural inequities, if you will, in our state, is to ask each town and city, as they put together their long-term economic recovery committee, to be inclusive, to include labor leaders, business leaders, clergy, immigrant group leaders, nonprofit leaders, faith leaders, so that the diversity of a particular community is well represented, and then to build back the economy, but build it back in ways to address those inequities that we have, unfortunately. Now is the moment.
Right. So tell us about the centennial celebrations that we were going to have. Is something coming up in the next week to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment?
So yes, there are many celebrations that have occurred. Our office did a special historic video focused on Connecticut and narrated by our women leaders in the state. And there have been a series of centennial celebrations. We've sort of had to modify them because I think that the Secretary of the State, Annie Lamont, and I, that we were the co-chairs of this celebration. And I think we envisioned having a lot of events that were parades or outdoor celebrations. And so we sort of changed the look, but people can go to the Secretary of the State's website for a calendar of events. But we've been celebrating all year, but sadly, a lot of the celebrations have been virtual as opposed to in person.
Yeah, that's too bad. Well, I've been doing a whole series of shows on the the suffrage movement, starting in
Excellent.
1848 with Seneca Falls. And our own Connecticut Historical Society did a wonderful project on rooting out Black suffrage supporters, women in the 1800s, because it's so important to understand that although the face of the movement were these white Protestant women for the most part that we think of, there were many others involved that were involved in corollary organizations that worked alongside suffrage. And so there were American Indians, there were Black women working alongside many men in the suffrage movement as well, Jewish women, Muslim women of all stripes working side by side to try to fight for suffrage. So the Connecticut Historical Society was a wonderful resource to learn about that.
Absolutely. And I'll just say a couple of other things about Connecticut's role in women's suffrage. So Eastern Connecticut actually was a key player because there were textile mills and thread mills across Eastern Connecticut. And the labor movement saw very early on that they would have more power if their members, if women that worked at those textile mills had the power of the vote. So a lot of the suffrage activity involved thread mills from Thompson and Putnam and Killingly, going all the way to Willimantic. And there were also women like Alice Paul, who spent the last part of her life in Ridgefield, and Kate Hepburn's mom. The Stows and the Beechers were very active. So Connecticut played an interesting role. There were some very influential women from our state that helped make a difference. And were
right. I did a show and learned about that, and it's fascinating. Katharine Hepburn's mother, exact same name. She was named after her mother. Was a suffragist, and it was wonderful to see that and see how her daughter carried on that tradition in the way she behaved, the way she acted, the way she dressed, and so forth. But I have to tell you, Susan, I was very disappointed in Connecticut in reading the history. You know that Tennessee was the final state to put the amendment over the top on August 18th, 1920.
So a day before Connecticut. Yep, unfortunately.
And Connecticut could have played that role, but apparently from what I have read, the governor at the time would have had to call a special session to take up the amendment, and he chose not to. So Connecticut did vote for the amendment finally after it passed the magic 36th state to ratify it in 1920. So we could have had an important role,
We could have, and Connecticut leads the way on a lot of things. So I was disappointed to learn that too. But what I loved was the story about the person who made the difference in Tennessee, and it was a lawmaker who received a letter from his mother, and he changed his vote. So always listen to your mom. She knows.
It was so interesting. It's a wonderful story because he was it was so fascinating to listen to this and read about it. People gathered in Nashville for days because the legislature in Tennessee was debating this the whole time. If you were against suffrage, you wore a red rose. If you were in favor of suffrage, you wore a yellow rose. And this young man was 28 years old. He had recently been elected as the youngest legislator in the State House of Representatives in Tennessee. And everyone counted on his vote for against. And yet, when they took the vote, it had been a tie before, and they thought there would still be a tie, which would lose the amendment. He voted for suffrage, for ratification, as a surprise because he was wearing a red rose. And of course, the next day, people were outraged at what he had done, but he spoke up and he said, look, always listen to your mother. She sent him a note at the last minute. Listen to Katty, which is Kay. What was her name?
I don't remember her name, but so right. Yeah. You can never go wrong listening to your mom. And that young man was on the right side of history, as it turned out.
Exactly. He knew that. So that was fascinating. There have been so many wonderful shows. PBS had a wonderful documentary on the suffrage movement, too.
I watched it. It was great.
And so many wonderful books on it also coming out. So I hope people will read about it, will study it, will go online to some of the virtual celebrations that are happening and pay attention. It's just too bad we couldn't get out there to the museums and the outdoor parades. That really would have been terrific. And I was hoping to go to a parade and wear my white outfit from head to toe, the same one I wore, Susan, in 2016 when I voted for Hillary Clinton and went to the polls and worked all day wearing white from head to toe because that was the colors, together with purple.
Well, as I think it's Cecile Richards said, there are a lot of women who've been waiting for this election since the day after the last one 4 years ago. And I think that's really the case. And so I think my parting message to everyone is please make a plan to vote. Vote by absentee if you would like. Vote in person if you would like. But make sure you cast your vote because nothing is more important.
Right. And don't let the propaganda about mail-in voting not being safe, don't let that affect you. It's not true. There are states in this country who use mail-in voting, universal mail-in voting, and they have had no issues for years. So please, you're right. And we're going to have other shows with more exact process for what you need to do about getting that application for your absentee ballot, filling it in, sending it by mail, or, Susan, putting it in a drop box in your town where you don't have to mail it, if you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Look for those white boxes with the state of Connecticut seal. That's exactly what those are for. So please.
And do it early. And you can still register to vote if you haven't. Do you know when the last day is that you can register?
So you can actually even vote in person. You can register to vote on the day of the election, but please don't wait. Make a plan. Get your absentee ballot application. You can look for those in the mail starting today because they are going out. Fill it out. Call your town clerk if you have any questions, because we don't want anybody wondering whether their ballot has been received and whether it's going to be counted.
Okay. And we need everyone to get out there and participate. That will make a difference. When people vote, we win.
There you go.
That's what happens. We've got to vote. And again, we've got to show that in America, we're concerned citizens. It's important to us who our leaders are. And we have to have more than 50, 60% of registered voters voting. Do you think we're going to get a big turnout? Make some final comments about that.
I really do. I really do, because I think the thousands of people who protested and did so peacefully during the summer, I think shows the appetite that people have. I think I've seen statistics that even though we're 58 days away from the election, people have already made up their mind. So now the only thing that we have to do is do it. Just go vote, either in person or by absentee ballot. But please, your vote is your voice. So make your voice heard.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. It's always great to have you. We'll have you on again from time to time and hope that we have a good fall for Connecticut and the country and a good November 3rd. Very important. So thank you, everybody, for watching the Lieutenant Governor. We'll see you next time on Talk Back. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.